I discovered my own family, mocking me as a doormat behind my back, so I quietly cut off every bill I paid for them. And now they're staring down eviction while I live my best life. My phone buzzed on the counter while I stirred a pot of pasta, and that single notification changed the rest of my life. It was a video from my cousin Megan. Usually she sent me cat videos or memes about being tired. This one was different. Her thumb must have slipped because the recording kept rolling long after she meant to stop it. I heard my mother's voice first, tinny through the speaker. Sydney should feel lucky. She'd be nothing without this family. My chest went hot. I turned the burner off without thinking. Then my father laughed, that easy laugh he used at barbecues. I wouldn't even miss her if she died tomorrow. At least she's useful for the big bucks. More laughter. Megan's voice, proud, like she was contributing a good idea to the group. If she ever stops sending cash, we just play the family card. She's too much of a pushover to say no. I stood frozen at my own stove, phone shaking in my hand. For 5 years, I'd paid my father's mortgage. I'd covered my brother Jason's tuition after he dropped out. I'd funded 3 family vacations I never got to attend because I was working overtime to pay for them. This was what they actually thought of me. A wallet. A punchline. The video cut out. A gray bubble replaced it. This message was unsent. Megan had panicked. She was 30 seconds too late. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone screaming. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood in my kitchen in Westerville, Ohio, listening to the pasta water go quiet, replaying their laughter like a song stuck on loop. The next morning, my mother texted like nothing had happened. Morning, honey. Checking in. Rent's due Thursday. Can you send it? Love you. Love you. After that recording, those 2 words tasted like something spoiled. My thumb hovered over the reply I always gave, the automatic, of course, sending now. Instead, I typed 4 words I had never said to her in 29 years. I can't this month. I set the phone down and waited. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. 1 minute passed, then 2. Then the flood came all at once. 3 texts stacked on top of each other before I could read the first one. What do you mean you can't? Sydney, this is serious. We're counting on you. Megan chimed in next, pretending to be worried, like she hadn't just handed me the truth 12 hours earlier. Hey girl, your mom's freaking out. Everything okay? I almost laughed out loud in my empty kitchen. Everything was, for the first time in years, perfectly fine. I typed 1 line back. Unexpected expenses. Can't send anything. Then I turned the phone face down again and made a cup of coffee, letting the silence on the other end do whatever it wanted to do. 2 days into the silence, my mother showed up at my office. I found out from the front desk, a message left with the receptionist, Linda, who buzzed up to my floor sounding slightly rattled. There's a woman down here saying she's your mom. She doesn't have a badge, so I can't let her pass the lobby, but she's asking me to tell you it's urgent. I told Linda I'd come down. I found my mother standing near the elevator bank in a blazer she only wore to church, holding her purse in both hands like a shield. I just want to talk, she said, before I'd even reached her. 5 minutes. You have 2, I said, and I meant it. She spent both of them describing how frightened she was, how my father wasn't sleeping, how Jason had nowhere else to turn. Not once, in either minute, did she ask how I was doing or mention the video at all. When security started glancing our way, she left with her jaw tight, telling me over her shoulder that she hoped I'd come to my senses soon. I rode the elevator back up to my floor and sat at my desk shaking for 20 minutes before I could look at a spreadsheet again. It didn't stay silent for long. That was only the beginning. I was 29 years old, and I had spent the last 5 of those years paying for a family that had a private nickname for me. I just hadn't known it until a video slipped through a crack it was never supposed to fall through. To understand how I got there, you have to go back to the house on Maplewood Drive and to a version of me who thought love was something you earned by being useful. I grew up in that house, Westerville, a quiet suburb north of Columbus, the kind of place with cul-de-sacs and a 4th of July parade every year. My father, Robert, worked 22 years at a manufacturing plant off Route 3 before the plant cut half its floor staff in 2019, and he was one of the names on the list. He was 54 then. He called it early retirement for a while. Everyone else called it what it was. My mother, Diane, worked part-time at a dental office, 3 days a week filing insurance claims. It was never quite enough to cover what my father's job used to cover, and after the layoff, the gap between what came in and what went out started to widen every month like a slow leak nobody wanted to patch. I have a younger brother, Jason. He's 26 now. Back then, he was 21, a sophomore at Ohio State, majoring in something he changed twice a semester. He dropped out in the spring of his 3rd year, $4,000 deep into a student loan and 2 classes short of nothing that mattered. Growing up, Jason was the one who got the benefit of the doubt, and I was the one who got the responsibility. That split started early. When I was 12 and he was 9, I remember my mother handing me an envelope of cash to walk to the corner store for milk and bread because you're responsible, you won't lose it. When Jason lost his lunch money twice in 1 week, nobody called him irresponsible. They called it a phase. I didn't resent it then. I liked being trusted. I didn't yet understand that being trusted and being used can wear the exact same clothes. I was the oldest. I was also, by pure accident of temperament, the one who was good with numbers. I loved spreadsheets the way some people love puzzles. I did my first babysitting job at 13 and kept a handwritten ledger of every dollar I earned, categorized by client, because it satisfied something in me to watch a column add up correctly. By 24, I had a job as a financial analyst at a logistics company downtown, making $61,000 a year, which which in that house felt like I'd won the lottery. My starting salary was more than my father had made in his final year at the plant. I didn't say that out loud to anyone, but I think everyone in that house did the math on their own, quietly, the same week I got the offer letter. My mother asked what my signing bonus was before she asked what the job actually involved. My father's mother, my grandmother Ruth, died when I was 19, and I only understood years later how much of my father's instincts had come from watching her. Ruth had raised 4 kids largely alone after my grandfather left, and family lore always painted her as fiercely resourceful, someone who could stretch a dollar further than anyone in the county. What the family didn't tell as often was that Ruth had a habit of leaning hardest on whichever of her 4 children was doing best in a given year, cycling her requests based on who'd just gotten a raise or a bonus or a new job. My father had been that child for a long stretch in his 30s, before the plant job steadied him. I used to think it was sad, a mother who struggled that much needing that much help. I didn't yet know that my father had absorbed the method along with the memory, and that I would eventually become the version of himself he remembered being. I remember the exact dinner where it started. Thanksgiving, 2021. I was 24. My dad raised his glass of sparkling cider because he didn't drink anymore, and said, "To Sydney, who's basically our family bank now." Everyone laughed. My mother added, "As long as the bank doesn't go on strike," and laughed harder than the joke deserved. I laughed too. I thought it was just a joke, the kind families make about each other at holidays, harmless and a little embarrassing. I didn't know yet that I was hearing a plan disguised as a punchline. There was an earlier version of that same joke, one I'd almost forgotten until I went looking for it later. The summer before, at a 4th of July cookout in the backyard on Maplewood Drive, my father's friend Gary from the plant had teased him about needing new patio furniture. My dad had pointed his spatula at me across the yard, 23 years old and holding a paper plate of hot dogs, and said, "Ask Sydney. She's the one with the good job now." Gary laughed. I laughed, a little uncomfortable, and changed the subject to something about the Reds game on the radio. I filed it away as a compliment. It took me years to recognize it as the first time my father introduced me to another adult, not as his daughter, but as a resource. My mother had her own version of the same instinct, quieter, and dressed up as concern. She used to call me on Sunday nights, ostensibly to catch up, and the conversation would always drift, gently and without fail, toward whatever bill was worrying her that week. She never asked outright in those early years. She'd just described the problem out loud, the electric bill, the property tax installment, the brake job Jason's old sedan needed, and wait. I always filled the silence. I thought that was what a good daughter did. I didn't realize for a long time that the silence itself was the ask. 2 months later, my dad called me on a Tuesday night, his voice low, almost ashamed. "I'm behind on the mortgage, Sid. Just $800. It's temporary. I'll pay you back next month." I sent it that night. Of course I did. He was my father. He'd taught me to ride a bike on that same street, running behind me with his hand on the seat, letting go before I noticed and cheering when I didn't fall. I owed him something for that, or so I told myself. He never paid me back. The next month, it was $900. Then it was the full payment because things got tight again. By the spring of 2022, I was quietly covering the entire $1,850 mortgage on my parents' house every single month, and nobody in that family called it a loan anymore. They called it help, the way you'd describe rain as weather. I want to be honest about something. There were moments during that first year where I almost stopped. In March of 2022, I sat down and did the math on what a year of mortgage payments would cost me against what I was putting into my own savings, and the number scared me enough that I called my father to say I needed to scale back. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just went quiet on the phone for a long moment and said, "I understand. I'll figure something out. I don't want you to stress about us." Then, 2 days later, my mother called. Not about the mortgage at all, just to talk, and somewhere in the middle of an ordinary conversation about her coworker's retirement party, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd been having chest tightness lately, and the doctor wanted to run some tests. I sent the mortgage payment that same week. Nobody ever asked me to connect those two calls. I connected them myself, and I've since learned that's exactly how it was supposed to work. That same spring, Jason called me crying, saying he needed a fresh start, that he'd made mistakes, that Ohio State wasn't for him, but a trade certification program might be. $14,600 later, spread across 2 semesters at a technical college in Dublin, Ohio, he had a certificate in HVAC repair that he never used, because 2 weeks after finishing the program, he decided the field wasn't really him either. I didn't complain. I told myself that's what family did. You invested in each other. You didn't keep score. Jason's tuition came with its own small scene I didn't think much of at the time. I drove him to the technical college in Dublin to help him register for his second semester, since his car was between repairs. In the parking lot before we went in, he turned to me and said, "You know you're the only one who actually believes in me, right?" It felt good to hear. I didn't notice, until much later, that he'd said the exact same sentence to me the month before, word for word, right before asking if I could cover his phone bill. I don't think he was lying either time. I think he'd simply learned, the way you learn any effective phrase, that certain words reliably opened a certain door, and he used them the way you'd use a key. Before any of this, before the mortgage and the tuition and the spreadsheet, there had been an ordinary, unremarkable closeness between us as a family that I don't want to erase just because of how it ended. We used to do a Sunday dinner every week without fail, no occasion required, just the 5 of us and whatever my mother had in the oven. My father used to call me on my drive home from work, not to ask for anything, just to talk about the Buckeyes or complain good-naturedly about his boss at the plant. Jason and I built an elaborate blanket fort in the living room the Christmas I was 13 and he was 10, and stayed up past midnight daring each other to sneak downstairs for cookies. None of that was staged. None of it was a setup for a later ask. It's part of why the spreadsheet cut as deep as it did. It wasn't that I'd never had a real family. It's that somewhere along the way, without my noticing the exact date it happened, the real family had quietly been replaced by a very convincing understudy wearing its face. Except somebody in that house had been keeping score the entire time. I just didn't know it was being kept against me. There was a moment I should have paid closer attention to, back in the summer of 2022, right after I'd wired Jason's second tuition payment. My mother mentioned, almost offhand over the phone, that the family was planning a trip to Gatlinburg for a long weekend in October. She asked if I could help cover the cabin rental, since I wasn't going to be able to come anyway because of work. I remember the sentence landing strange in my stomach, not the money part. The way she'd already decided I wasn't invited in the same breath as asking me to pay for it. I brushed the feeling aside. I told myself I was being sensitive, that of course they wanted me there, that work really was busy that month. I paid for that trip, $2,100 for the cabin. I didn't go. Nobody asked twice. There were 2 more trips like that over the following 2 years, a beach week in Hilton Head and a ski cabin outside of Boone, North Carolina. I funded both. I attended neither. Total cost across the 3 trips came to just over $6,200. I have the receipts. I've always had the receipts. It's the one habit from my job I never turned off. By the time I was 28, I was covering my father's mortgage, had fully paid off Jason's failed tuition, and had quietly bankrolled family vacations I existed only as a name on the reservation and a number in an app. I told myself a story about why this was fine. My father had struggled since the layoff. My mother worked hard at a job that didn't pay what it should. Jason was young, still finding his footing. I had more than they did. What kind of person hoards money while their family sinks? My closest friend at work, a senior analyst named Priya, tried to poke a hole in that story more than once. We'd been hired within a month of each other, and by year 3, we ate lunch together most days, usually at a sandwich place 2 blocks from the office. Somewhere around my second year of covering the mortgage, she noticed I flinched every time my phone lit up with my mother's name. "You do know that's not normal, right?" she said one Tuesday, watching me silence a call mid-bite. "The way you brace before you even look at the screen. They're just going through a rough patch," I told her, the sentence so automatic by then it barely needed thought behind it. "For 3 years?" Priya raised an eyebrow but let it go, the way good friends do when they can see you're not ready to hear something yet. She brought it up twice more over the following 2 years, always gently, always in a way I could wave off. I didn't get defensive at her. I just quietly stopped mentioning the family calls at lunch, which in hindsight was its own kind of answer. That story worked for a long time. It worked right up until a video slipped past a thumb that wasn't supposed to press record, and I heard in my own mother's voice what she actually thought the story was. She'd be nothing without this family. He wouldn't even miss me if I died. Just play the family card, she's too much of a pushover to say no. 5 years, $138,000, give or take. Once I sat down later and added every wire transfer, every rent payment, every tuition installment, every vacation invoice, $138,000, and the word they used for it behind my back was pushover. After I texted my mother, "I can't this month," and turned my phone face down, I thought the storm would pass in an hour. I was wrong. It lasted 6 days, and each day it grew a new shape. The guilt came first, right on schedule. My mother called 4 times before noon. When I didn't pick up, she switched to texts. "We raised you, Sydney. Is this how you repay us?" Then, an hour later, "Your brother is going to get evicted from his apartment, and that's on you now." Jason didn't have his own apartment. He'd been living at my parents' house since dropping out. She knew that. She sent it anyway. I didn't respond to any of it. I went to work. I sat in a budget review meeting and presented quarterly numbers with a completely steady voice while my phone buzzed against my leg every few minutes in my blazer pocket. By that evening, the tone had shifted. My father's message came in flat and hard. No warmth left in it at all. "You're being selfish, Sydney. This family needs you. Grow up. Grow up." I was 29 years old with a savings account I'd built almost entirely by accident because I'd never had the chance to spend money on myself. I read that message twice and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Then came Megan's voice message. The same cousin whose slipped thumb had started all of this. My hands actually trembled before I pressed play, some part of me still hoping she'd apologize. "Sydney, your mom is losing her mind. Your dad is furious, and honestly, I don't blame them. You've always been ungrateful, but this is beyond selfish. You don't even need that money. They gave you life, and now you're walking away? Cross this line and there's no coming back. Not one word of concern for me. Not one question about why I might have stopped. Just fury that their personal ATM had gone offline. Before I blocked anyone, I called Priya. I hadn't planned to. My thumb just found her name in my recent calls without asking my brain for permission. I played her the saved copy of the video, the one Megan hadn't managed to delete from my phone before it vanished from hers, and I listened to Priya go completely silent on the other end for almost 10 seconds. "Sydney," she finally said, "I need you to hear me say this clearly. That is not a family joking around. That is 3 adults describing a con, and you're the mark." Something about hearing it named so plainly insanely by someone who had no stake in protecting any of them, cracked something open in me that 3 years of my own quiet doubt hadn't managed to. I didn't argue with her. I just said, I know, and realized, as I said it, that I actually did. I blocked my mother. I blocked my father. I blocked Megan. My phone went quiet for the first time in 5 years, and the quiet felt like walking into a cold room after being too warm for too long. Uncomfortable. Necessary. It didn't stay quiet. 2 mornings later, Jason pounded on my apartment door before 7 a.m., hair wild, wearing yesterday's clothes, like he'd slept in his car in my parking lot to catch me before work. Are you serious right now? He said, before I'd even opened the door all the way. You blocked everyone. Mom's freaking out. Dad's losing it. I crossed my arms in the doorway and didn't invite him in. Maybe I got tired of being your ATM, Jason. I've covered your rent, your groceries, your subscriptions for years, I said. The one time I say no, I'm suddenly the villain. That video wasn't serious, he muttered, not meeting my eyes. We were joking. Joking, I repeated, keeping my voice flat. You called me a pathetic failure who should be grateful to pay your bills. Do you know what that feels like? He didn't have an answer for that, so he reached for something uglier instead. Fine, be selfish, but don't come crawling back when you realize you have nobody. He slammed his car door hard enough that a neighbor's porch light clicked on, and he sped out of the lot with his tires chirping against the curb. I stood in my doorway a long time after his taillights disappeared, spine straight, arms still crossed. He was wrong. I had myself. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough. That should have been the end of it. One bad week. A family finally hearing the word no. It wasn't, because underneath the guilt trips and the insults, something else had been quietly building for months. Something I hadn't noticed until I went looking for it. It started with a spreadsheet. Ordinary, almost boring. In February, months before the video, my father had called and asked if I could set up something to get the household organized, since bills had started slipping through the cracks. I was good with numbers. Of course I'd help. I built a shared Google sheet called Household Planning, gave him edit access under his email, and populated it with categories. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, Jason's car insurance. It felt, at the time, like a small act of care, a daughter helping her overwhelmed parents get their footing back. I filled it in faithfully every month. I never once thought to scroll past the tabs I'd created myself. Around that same time, a new request landed, one I now recognize as step 4 in a pattern I couldn't yet see the shape of. Jason needed a truck for a new job lead, something in delivery driving that never quite materialized. My father asked if I'd co-sign the auto loan just to get Jason approved, just until his credit improved. It's a formality, Sid, he said on the phone. The bank just needs a name with better numbers on it. You won't pay a dime. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it, in my kitchen, phone against my shoulder while I unloaded the dishwasher, and I remember believing him completely. $22,000, financed through a dealership off Cleveland Avenue. I signed at a folding table in a glass-walled office while a salesman named Perry congratulated Jason on his fresh start. Jason made 2 payments, then none. By month 3, the missed payments were reporting against my credit, not his, because my name sat first on the loan. I called him about it. He said he'd get to it. He never did. When I pushed harder the second time, he told me I was being dramatic over a couple $100. And when I pushed a third time, he stopped answering my calls entirely for 11 days, which I now recognize as its own kind of leverage. Silence from Jason always got treated like a small family emergency, something my mother would ask me to just let go for the sake of peace. I ended up quietly covering that payment too, folding it into the same monthly rhythm as the mortgage. Another line item I didn't examine too closely because examining it too closely meant admitting how much of my income had a permanent home in someone else's life. There was a 5th request tucked in around the same period, smaller in dollars but sharper in how it made me feel. My mother asked if I could pay for Jason's health insurance premium after he aged off my father's old plan, since he was between jobs and just needed 6 months to get settled. $290 a month paid directly to the insurer under my card on file. 6 months became 14. Every time I brought it up, my mother reframed it instantly. Do you want your brother to have no coverage if something happens to him? She'd ask. And the question always landed exactly where it was aimed, somewhere just beneath my ribs, and I always backed down. There was a 6th moment too, one that in hindsight was the boldest overreach before the video, though at the time it was dressed up as flattery. In March, my father called a rare sit-down dinner at the house, all of us at the table, even Megan, who almost never came to weeknight dinners. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down with a small, deliberate clink and said he'd been thinking that since I was so good with this stuff, maybe it made sense for me to just officially take over running the household finances. Not informally, the way I already was, officially. He wanted to add me as a joint account holder on his checking account, so things run smoother, he said. So we're not always chasing you down for one thing or another. I remember the table going quiet, waiting for my answer, Megan watching me with a strange, expectant look, like she already knew what the right answer was supposed to be. Something in me resisted, some instinct I couldn't yet name. Let me think about it, I said, which was as close to a no as I'd managed to say to my father in years. He didn't push that night. He just nodded, said, "Of course, no rush," in a tone that suggested the opposite, and the topic was quietly reintroduced twice more over the following month, each time a little more urgently, each time framed as something that would make my life easier rather than theirs. nightmares. I kept deflecting. I never did figure out until the spreadsheet that a joint account would have removed the last remaining barrier between what I earned and what they could simply take without asking. The seventh step was the one that should have broken the spell completely, and in hindsight, I think it was designed to be the final one before the video accident interrupted everything. In April, my mother called sounding different than usual. Quiet, scared. She said she needed a procedure done, something with her gallbladder, and the insurance wasn't covering enough of it. She said the number through what sounded like tears. $3,000. I didn't hesitate. You don't hesitate when your mother says she's scared about a surgery. I asked her which hospital, whether she needed someone to drive her, whether my father was handling everything okay. She gave short, distracted answers, the kind you'd give if you were focused on pain and not conversation, and I believed every one of them. I wired it that same afternoon, and I called her that night to check on her, genuinely frightened for the first time in this whole exhausting arrangement. She sounded surprised I'd called. She recovered quickly, said she was fine, tired but fine, and changed the subject to ask whether I'd seen anything about the Gatlinburg trip pricing for the following spring. I remember hanging up that night feeling something close to relief, grateful that whatever had scared her had apparently passed so easily. I didn't yet know that ease was the whole design. A crisis that resolves itself within one phone call doesn't usually get questioned. It just gets filed away as good news, and good news, unlike bad news, nobody double checks. I didn't think about that phone call again until the video, 3 weeks later, cracked the whole story open. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The week after I blocked all 3 of them, I sat down one night to update the household planning spreadsheet out of pure muscle memory, the same way you keep locking a door in a house you no longer live in. I opened the file to log May's numbers. I meant to close it right after. Instead, my eye caught on a second tab at the bottom of the screen, one I hadn't created. It was labeled projections. I almost didn't click it. Some instinct told me not to. I clicked it anyway. It was a forecast, built in my father's careful, blocky handwriting style of formatting, dated back 3 years, well before the mortgage even became my responsibility. Rows for each year, columns estimating my likely raises based on my job title and industry averages he must have looked up. Beside each projected raise sat a dollar figure, and beside that, a note. Ask after her bonus. Easier to say yes when she feels flush. Wait until she's stressed with work, less likely to push back. If she resists mortgage, frame as temporary, revisit in 60 days. Some notes were initialed R, some were initialed D. My father and my mother planning, in writing, years in advance, exactly how and when to extract more money from me. Timed to moments they predicted I'd be too tired or too flush or too guilty to say no. I sat perfectly still in my kitchen and read it 3 times, waiting for a different explanation to appear. None came. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a family stumbling through hard times and leaning too hard on the one kid with a stable job. This was a plan, built with the same cold precision I used at work, except the asset they were managing was me. I scrolled further and found a third tab, this one titled Jason, Truck Payment Buffer. Buried in a row dated April, the same week my mother called crying about her gallbladder, sat an entry. $3,000. Description. Covers 2 months truck payment plus buffer, per D. No mention of any surgery. No mention of any insurance gap. My mother's fear on the phone, the tremor in her voice, had been a performance written into a household ledger, filed under my brother's missed car payments. I kept scrolling, past columns I now read with a completely different eye. Near the bottom of the projections tab, in a row dated almost 4 years back, before I'd ever paid a single mortgage payment, sat a note that stopped me cold. If Sydney well runs dry, ask Carol again. She always caves by the 3rd call. My aunt's name, sitting in the same ledger as mine, a second well marked out years in advance for whenever the first one stopped producing. I sat with that for a long time before I understood what it meant. This hadn't started with me. I wasn't the first person in that family to be quietly mapped out on a spreadsheet and mined on a schedule. I was simply the one with the highest yield, which meant I'd been given the most attention. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't shock, not exactly. Some part of me, the part that had flinched at my mother's Sunday night silences for years, had probably suspected something like this long before I had proof of it. What I felt was closer to relief, the strange, guilty relief of finally being handed evidence for a feeling I'd spent 5 years being told was paranoid, ungrateful, and dramatic. I wasn't crazy. I had simply been outmatched by people who'd had a 3-year head start on a plan I didn't know existed. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later, sharper and more useful. What I felt first was something closer to grief, the specific kind that comes from realizing a story you told yourself for years was never true. I opened my banking app that same night and pulled every record I had. 5 years of wire transfers to my father, every tuition payment to the technical college in Dublin, every vacation invoice with my name on the billing line, every auto loan statement with the missed payment flags attached. I built a single document, laid it all out by date and amount, and let the total calculate itself at the bottom. $138,412. I titled the document My Final Statement. Above the numbers, I typed one line. You don't owe me money. You owe yourselves the truth about what you took. I addressed it to all 3 of them, attached the spreadsheet screenshots of the projections tab and the Jason, truck payment buffer buffer tab alongside my own records and let my cursor sit over the send button for a long moment, not from doubt, but because some part of me understood that sending it would close a door I could never reopen. Before I could press it, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize, forwarded into what used to be our family group chat by someone who apparently still had access. It was a photograph of my parents' front lawn on Maplewood Drive. A red and white sign had been staked into the grass near the mailbox. Official looking, the kind you see outside houses that are about to belong to a bank instead of a family. I could just make out a few words before I set the phone down. Notice, foreclosure, sale. I didn't send my email that night, I drove there instead. Maplewood Drive looked exactly the way it had my whole childhood, except for the sign. Someone had planted a sheriff's notice of pending foreclosure sale at the edge of the lawn, close enough to the mailbox that the mail carrier would have seen it that morning, close enough that every neighbor walking a dog past that house would see it too. My father's truck was in the driveway. My mother's sedan sat crooked behind it, like it had been parked in a hurry. Jason's borrowed car, the one he'd used since the truck got repossessed weeks earlier without me ever hearing about it, sat at the curb. I found out later that the mortgage hadn't just fallen behind after I stopped paying. It had been behind for 4 months before the video ever leaked, because my father had made a bet, one he never said out loud to me but had clearly written down in a spreadsheet, that no matter how tight things got, Sydney would come through eventually, the way she always had. He'd stopped paying not because he'd lost hope in me. He'd stopped paying because he'd never once doubted me. The eviction wasn't caused by my silence. It was caused by his certainty that my silence would never actually happen. I parked at the curb and walked up the same driveway I'd learned to ride a bike on, folder of printed statements under my arm. The foreclosure notice was staked closer to the mailbox than I'd realized from the photo, laminated against the rain, with a case number printed along the bottom in small type. I stopped in front of it for a second before I went up the walk. I'd learned to ride a bike on this exact stretch of concrete. Now it had a sheriff's notice of pending foreclosure sale planted in the grass beside it like a flag. My mother opened the door before I knocked, and for one unguarded second her face showed real relief, like she thought I'd come to fix it. Then she saw my expression and the relief drained out of her. Sydney, her voice cracked around my name. Thank God we've been trying to reach you. There's been a mistake with the bank. They're saying, I know what they're saying, I said. I can see the sign from the street. My father appeared behind her, and Jason came out from the garage, still holding a socket wrench, and somewhere behind them I heard a car door. My Aunt Carol's voice calling out that she'd gotten here as fast as she could. Megan's car pulled up a moment later too, apparently summoned by the same panicked group text that had reached my aunt, and she got out slowly, like she already sensed she wasn't walking into the kind of crisis she'd expected. A small, unplanned audience, assembling on a Tuesday afternoon in front of a house with a government notice staked into the lawn. We need to talk about the mortgage, my father said, already reaching for the tone he used when he wanted something. This is bigger than whatever happened with that video, Sid. We could lose the house. You already lost it, I said, 4 months ago, before I ever stopped paying. His face didn't understand yet. I opened the folder and held up the first page, the printed screenshot of the projections tab, his handwriting style formatting unmistakable even in black and white. Ask after her bonus. Easier to say yes when she feels flush. I read it out loud, slow, so nobody in that driveway could pretend they'd misheard. My mother went pale. My father's jaw tightened. Jason lowered the wrench. That's not what it looks like, my father started. It's exactly what it looks like, I said. You built a plan to take money from me for years before you ever asked me for $1. And Mom. I turned to her, held up the second page. Jason, truck payment buffer. $3,000. The same week you called me crying about a gallbladder surgery that never happened. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Behind her, I heard my Aunt Carol go very quiet. You said you were scared, I said, and for the first time my voice shook, not from anger but from something older and sadder underneath it. I called that night because I was scared for you, and it was a line item in a spreadsheet. We were going to pay you back, my mother said, the words small and automatic, the same sentence I'd heard for 5 years about a debt that had never once shrunk. No, I said, you weren't. There's no repayment tab. I checked. There's only a projection of what you thought you could keep taking, and notes on the best time to ask. Jason set the wrench down on the porch railing. He looked, for the first time in this entire ordeal, genuinely unsettled, like he was seeing his parents from an angle he hadn't chosen to look at before. I'm not your bank, I said, loud enough that it carried across the yard, past my aunt, past whatever neighbor might have been watching from a window. I was never your bank. I was your daughter, and you traded that for a spreadsheet and a schedule of late fees. Nobody had anything to say to that. Not my father, who'd built the plan. Not my mother, who'd executed the lie about her health. Not Jason, who'd laughed on a video meant to stay private. The silence in that driveway lasted longer than any of the 6 days of guilt trips combined. Aunt Carol was the one who finally broke it, and not in my father's favor. Robert, her voice was quiet, but it carried. Is that your handwriting on that page? My father didn't answer. That silence answered for him. I lent you $9,000 in 2019, Carol said, and you told me you'd have it back within the year. I never saw it again. I always thought it was because things were just that hard for you. She looked at the printed page still in my hand, at the note with her own name folded into someone else's spreadsheet. I didn't realize I was a line item. Megan stood near her car, arms wrapped around herself, saying nothing, and I watched something shift across her face, the particular look of someone recalculating every memory of a person they thought they knew. Jason set the socket wrench down on on the porch railing and finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, is that real? Did you actually write that?" He wasn't asking me. He was asking my father directly, and something about hearing the question come from him instead of me seemed to land harder than anything I'd said all afternoon. My father opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again. And in that silence, I watched my brother understand, maybe for the first time, that he hadn't just been the beneficiary of my exhaustion. He'd been raised inside the same plan I had, just positioned on a different side of the ledger. My mother tried one more time, her voice pitching higher, more desperate. "You're going to let us lose the house over some spreadsheet? Over a joke that got out of hand? Family forgives, Sydney. That's what family does. Family doesn't forecast my bonuses," I said. "Family doesn't fake a surgery to cover a truck payment. You didn't lose this house over a joke. You lost it because you stopped paying for it 4 months before I ever found out what you actually thought of me, and you kept betting I'd cover it anyway because you'd never once been wrong before." I left the folder with them, every page, and walked back to my car. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. The weeks that followed unraveled in ways I hadn't fully predicted, even after years of watching that family manage a crisis by finding someone else to absorb it. The house went into a short sale by the end of that summer, sold for $11,000 less than what was owed, a gap my parents had to negotiate with the lender directly, without me anywhere near the paperwork. It took 3 months to close, 3 months of my father calling the mortgage servicer and being put on hold, of my mother driving to a hearing at the county courthouse to request a short postponement, of paperwork with my father's name on it that no longer had mine attached anywhere at all. I found out later, secondhand through Jason, that the bank had briefly flagged the file for possible fraud, since the account showed years of consistent on-time payments followed by an abrupt, total stop, the kind of pattern that usually means something changed in a household, not that a household simply ran out of money. Nobody flagged it as what it actually was, a daughter closing an account she never should have been asked to hold open in the first place. My father, 61 years old, moved into a 2-bedroom rental off Schrock Road with my mother, a place smaller than any home they'd lived in during their marriage, with a landlord who required first month, last month, and a security deposit before handing over a key. My mother went from 3 days a week at the dental office to 5 because the math no longer worked any other way. My father, at 61, started picking up handyman work through a neighborhood app, the same kind of odd jobs he used to joke he'd never have to do again once his daughter was settled. 6 weeks after the move, he tried to dispute the auto loan reporting on my credit, calling the lender directly to argue that the loan had always really belonged to Jason. The dealership told him, correctly, that the paperwork said otherwise, and the calls stopped. I ended up spending $400 of my own money on a consultation with a consumer credit attorney in Columbus, just to understand my options for separating myself from that loan entirely. She told me what I already suspected. Because Jason was the primary driver and I was only the co-signer, I had almost no leverage to remove my name without refinancing the loan into his name alone, which required a credit score he didn't have. My best option, she said, was simply to keep paying it down responsibly until it could be refinanced, protecting my own score in the process, and to get everything in writing going forward if I ever agreed to anything like this again. I left her office with a single sentence underlined twice in my notebook. Never co-sign for anyone who has already shown you they won't carry their own weight. It cost $400 to learn something I should have already known for free. The neighbors on Maplewood Drive noticed the sign before most of the family had even processed what it meant. Mrs. Okafor, 2 doors down, the same woman who used to wave at me every morning while I waited for the school bus as a kid, texted my mother asking if everything was all right, and word moved through that street the way it always does, quietly and completely. By the time the moving truck actually arrived that August, half the cul-de-sac already knew the broad shape of what had happened, if not the specifics of a spreadsheet nobody outside our family would ever see. My mother told me later, in one of our rare civil conversations, that walking out to get the mail those last few weeks had become its own small daily humiliation, and I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I understood that feeling better than she knew, since I'd been performing a version of normal in front of coworkers for years, while quietly bleeding money into that same house. My father tried one more public move that fall, one that embarrassed him more than it helped him. He started a fundraiser online, a modest page asking for help with unexpected housing costs after a family hardship, with a photo of the Maplewood Drive house attached. It raised $640 in its first 2 days, mostly from old coworkers and neighbors who didn't know the details. Then someone I never found out who, though I have my suspicions about Jason's friend circle, commented a screenshot of Jason's old social media post about family members turning their backs, next to a screenshot of a much older post where my father had joked, publicly, about his daughter being his personal ATM machine. The donations stopped within the hour. My father took the page down before the end of the week. Aunt Carol called me 2 days after the driveway confrontation. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I need to tell you something," she said. "In 2019, right after your dad lost the plant job, I lent them $9,000. I never saw a cent of it back. I always told myself it was because things were hard for them. I never once thought to ask if it was a pattern." She paused. "I'm sorry, Sydney. I should have warned you a long time ago." She didn't offer to take my parents in when the house sold, and I understood, finally hearing her story, exactly why. She helped them find the rental rental instead, co-signing nothing, lending nothing, just driving my mother to 2 viewings and helping carry boxes on moving day, kept a careful, guarded distance, the kind you keep from a fire you've already been burned by once. I love my sister, she told me over coffee that August, stirring a cup she never drank much of. I'm just done being surprised by her. Carol became, unexpectedly, the person I called most that year. She was the one who explained things I hadn't thought to ask about, like how my father had once asked her son, my cousin Danny, to co-sign a small business loan in his 20s that never turned into a business at all. Just 6 months of missed payments Danny quietly absorbed and never told anyone about until Carol pried it out of him years later. Hearing that made something in me settle that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. It wasn't just me. It had never been just me. I was only the version of the pattern that finally had the paperwork to prove it. Jason tried a different approach. 2 weeks after the driveway, he posted something vague on social media about family members who turn their backs when things get hard, clearly aimed at me without naming me directly. It didn't land the way he wanted. A few of his own friends, people who'd been in that circle long enough to have heard whispers over the years, started asking pointed questions in the comments. One person, a girl he'd dated briefly the year before, wrote that she remembered him joking more than once about milking Sydney for money. The post disappeared within a day. He showed up at my apartment again about a month later, this time without pounding on the door. He knocked once, softly, and when I opened it, he just stood there for a second before saying, "I got a job, real one, warehouse supervisor, off 270. He didn't ask for anything, he just wanted me to know. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I let him say it. It took Jason another 4 months to actually say the word sorry out loud, and when he did, it wasn't dramatic. We were sitting in my car outside his new apartment, a small place off Cleveland Avenue he'd signed the lease for entirely on his own, and he said, without looking at me, "I laughed on that video because it was easier than admitting I felt like garbage every time I asked you for money. I'm sorry. I mean it." I didn't fully believe him that day. I believe him more now, 6 months and 1 full year of steady paychecks later, though I've learned not to measure belief in this family with anything other than time. Megan reached out twice. The first message was defensive, insisting the video wasn't that deep, that I was overreacting to one dumb comment. I didn't respond. The second message, 3 weeks later, was different. She admitted she'd known about the spreadsheet, that my father had shown her the projections tab once, half joking, and she'd laughed along instead of saying anything. "I should have told you," she wrote. "I was scared of them being mad at me instead of you." I didn't forgive her right away. I told her I needed time, and for once, nobody in that family pushed back on hearing the word no. We finally sat down in person that October at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 apartments, neutral ground neither of us had any history in. She looked smaller across the table than she had in my memory, less like the confident cousin who'd narrated a plan for extracting cash from me, and more like a 27-year-old who'd spent years going along with whatever kept the peace. "I've known your dad my whole life," she said, turning her cup slowly on the table. "It's easy to convince yourself you're just being a good niece when really you're just being a coward." I didn't have a neat response to that. I just told her I appreciated her saying it out loud, and that trust, unlike an apology, wasn't something that could be delivered in a single sitting. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly that answer, and had made peace with it before she ever sat down. My father tried one last move, the kind I should have expected given everything I now knew about how he operated. 6 weeks after the driveway, I got a call from an unknown number, my mother's voice thin and shaking, saying my father had collapsed, that he was at Mount Carmel St. Anne's, that it might be his heart. For a moment, old instinct took over completely. I was already reaching for my car keys, already rehearsing which exit off 71 got me there fastest. Then I stopped. I stood in my kitchen, keys in hand, and made myself think instead of react, the same way I'd trained myself to do with a spreadsheet that didn't balance. I sat in my car in a parking garage downtown for 10 full minutes before I called the hospital directly instead of driving there. No patient by that name had been admitted that day. I called again 20 minutes later, in case of some intake delay. Still nothing. When I called my mother back to ask which floor he was on, she went quiet for 3 full seconds, then said he'd been moved to a different facility, then hung up on me before I could ask which one. I never got confirmation of what the plan had actually been. I didn't need it. I understood, based on everything already sitting in that spreadsheet, exactly what it looked like, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt something closer to pity than anger. A man who had once run behind my bicycle with his hand on the seat had run out of real ways to reach me, and the only tool he had left was fear. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I drove past Maplewood Drive one last time, after the new owners had already moved a moving truck into the driveway. I sat at the curb for a few minutes, engine off, looking at the yard where my father had once run behind my bike, hand steady on the seat, laughing every time I wobbled and stayed upright anyway. That memory was real. I know it was real. That's what made the grief so specific. It wasn't that nothing good had ever happened in that house. It was that somewhere between that bike and that spreadsheet, the people who taught me to balance had decided I was more useful falling, as long as I kept paying for the bruises. I let myself cry there, alone in the car, for the father who taught me to ride a bike and not for the one who wrote projections about my bonuses. I think that's an important distinction. Grief doesn't require the whole person to have been good. It just requires that some part part of them once was, and that the part is gone now too. I thought about a specific afternoon, the summer I turned 7, when I'd finally stayed upright the whole length of Maplewood Drive without him holding on. I'd turned around, wobbling, triumphant, expecting to find him still jogging somewhere behind me. Instead, he was standing exactly where he'd let go, arms raised over his head, shouting my name down the street like I'd won something enormous. For years, that was my proof that he loved me without any conditions attached. Sitting in that car outside a house that no longer belonged to him, I understood that both things could be true at once. He had loved me that day on the sidewalk. He had also, years later, written my name into a column and asked when it would be most convenient to collect. I didn't need to choose which father was the real one. I only needed to accept that I would never get the first one back, and that grief, not anger, was the more honest thing to feel about that. It's been 8 months since that video slipped through a thumb that wasn't supposed to press record. I still live in the same one-bedroom apartment in Westerville, the one Jason once pounded on the door of before 7 in the morning. I got promoted that fall, finance manager instead of analyst, a title that came with a number I no longer feel obligated to explain to anyone. I started seeing a therapist on Tuesdays, a small, unglamorous habit that has done more for me than any spreadsheet ever did. I opened a savings account with a name only I know the password to, and for the first time since I was 24, every dollar in it stays exactly where I put it. My relationship with Jason is slow and careful, built one honest conversation at a time instead of one transaction at a time. We got coffee last month. He paid, which shouldn't feel significant, and did anyway. He's saving for his own place with a second bedroom, he told me, not because he needs one, but because he wants somewhere I'd actually want to visit. My relationship with Aunt Carol is warmer, honest in a way it never had room to be, before we both admitted what that family had cost us separately for years. We have dinner every few weeks now, no ledger between us, just two people comparing notes on a fire we both survived. Megan and I talk occasionally, still rebuilding something neither of us has a name for yet. Texts more than calls, small and careful, the way you'd approach a dog that had bitten you once out of fear rather than cruelty. 2 weekends ago, I hosted a small dinner in my apartment, the kind of gathering I never could have imagined during the years I was funding vacations I wasn't invited to. Priya came straight from a work trip, still in her travel clothes. Aunt Carol brought a pie she'd baked herself, apologizing for the slightly burnt crust in a way that made everyone laugh. Jason showed up 20 minutes early to help me set the table, which felt so out of character for the person who used to sleep through noon that I almost mentioned it, then decided to just let it be normal instead of remarkable. We ate at my small table for 4, elbows nearly touching, and nobody once asked me for money, and nobody once needed to. My parents and I speak rarely. A text at Christmas, a birthday message I sometimes answer and sometimes don't. No large amount of money has passed between us since the driveway, and none ever will again. I used to think that made me the villain of their story. I've since accepted that I'm allowed to be the only hero of my own. I used to believe that being a doormat meant being invisible, meant having no voice at all. I understand it differently now. A doormat isn't voiceless. It's just been trained to think its only value is in being walked on. The day I read those 4 words back to myself, I can't this month, I finally understood that a doormat can, in fact, get up and walk straight out the front door it used to lie in front of. There's a version of this story where I burned everything down out of spite, where I confronted them for the satisfaction of watching a sign stake itself into their lawn. That was never it. I didn't cause the eviction. I only stopped paying for a debt I never should have been carrying in the first place, and the truth about that house did the rest on its own. Something real was lost on Maplewood Drive, and I don't pretend otherwise. I lost the family I thought I had, the one I spent 5 years and $138,000 trying to hold together. What I found instead was smaller, quieter, and entirely mine. People sometimes ask me if I regret sending that first text, the 4 words that started all of it. I don't. What I regret is how long it took a phone's accidental slip to teach me something I should have been able to see on my own. That love which requires a monthly payment isn't love. It's an invoice with better branding. I'm not angry that I helped my family. I'm grieving that help was never really what they wanted from me. They wanted a resource that occasionally visited for Thanksgiving. Some nights that trade still aches. Most nights, it just feels like ease.